You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Ben Franklin's World is a production of Colonial Williamsburg Innovation Studios. Hello, and welcome to Ben Franklin's World Revisited, a series of classic episodes that bring fresh perspective to our latest episodes and add deeper connections to our understanding of early American history. And I'm your host, Liz Covart. It's November, the time of year when we Americans get ready for the Thanksgiving holiday. Now, although the federal holiday that we know and honor today came about in 1863, when Sarah Josepha Hale petitioned President Abraham Lincoln to issue a proclamation declaring a day of Thanksgiving in honor of the Civil War soldiers, the day we celebrate as Thanksgiving today is a holiday that we modern-day Americans associate with the Indigenous peoples and religious separatists of Plymouth, Massachusetts. So what do we know about the Indigenous people that the so-called Pilgrims interacted with? This month, in between our new episodes about Indigenous history, the Ben Franklin's World Revisited series will explore the world of the Wampanoag. The World of the Wampanoag originally posted as a 2-episode miniseries in December 2020. This first episode will introduce you to the life, societies, and cultures of the Wampanoag and Narragansett peoples. These are the peoples the Plymouth colonists interacted with after the colonists arrived in the area in December 1620. Now, the second episode, which will post after episode 398, will help us understand how the world of the Wampanoag changed and stayed the same after the religious separatists arrived at Plymouth. So with that, I hope you enjoy exploring the world of the Wampanoag, a people who still proudly live in present-day Massachusetts and Rhode Island. New England. Today, that name evokes a mental image of a region in the northeastern United States. New England is a region made up of 6 states: Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. All but one of those states borders the Atlantic Ocean. In its interior, much of New England has a rocky, even mountainous topography, heavily forested in many places. Traveling north from Virginia, Captain John Smith gave the region this English name in 1616. But New England has had a different name for much longer.
The word that comes to my mind is the Dawn Land, because that's used a lot today to represent us, the people of the East, where the sun rises in the morning. We're the people of the dawn. So I'm Loren Spears. I'm the executive director of Tamaquag Museum, Askawee Kwasin, Natasuis Makasini Pashao, Narragansett, Natasuis Loren Spears, Englishat, Ni Narragansett Nehantek, Kanupiam at Aki Narragansett. And so what I said to you in my language was hello, and that I'm Loren Spears, and my traditional name is Makasini Pashao, and I am Narragansett Niantic, and welcome to the homelands of the Narragansett people.
We know for my people, we've been around this area for over 12,000 years. And we believe we come from the Southwest after many ice age that happened. So that's why we believe all South, Central, and North American Indigenous people are pretty much all the same in a way, how we think about land, life in general, So we worked our way up here, and we've been here, like I said, for over 12,000 years. My name is Darius Coombs. I'm Mashpee Wampanoag. I'm the director of Wampanoag and Algonquin Interpretive Training, and I work at Plymouth Patuxet Museum.
Before New England was New England, it was the Dawn Land, a region that still serves as the homeland of numerous Native American peoples, including the Wabanaki, Abenaki, Pequot, Mohegan, Mohican, Nipmuc, Niantic, Narragansett, and Wampanoag, to name just a few. Over the next 2 episodes, we'll explore the world of the Wampanoag before and after 1620, when 100 English settlers arrived in their world on a ship called the Mayflower, to a place the English would call Plymouth. Those settlers have been called Pilgrims over the years, and this year, 2020, is the 400th anniversary of their arrival in New England. Now, some things changed dramatically for the Wampanoag, but some aspects of Wampanoag life and culture persisted, as did the Wampanoag, who lived and still live in Massachusetts and beyond. Now, when those 100 English colonists arrived in what is today Plymouth, Massachusetts, they settled in the lands of the Wampanoag. In this episode, episode 290, our focus will be on life, cultures, and trade in the world of the Wampanoag and their neighbors, up to December 16, 1620, the day the Mayflower made its way into Plymouth Harbor. Our focus on life, cultures, and trade will help us develop a better understanding for the peoples, places, and circumstances of the world of the Wampanoag. So, just who were and are the Wampanoag who lived and live around present-day Plymouth? Who are some of their closest neighbors, the Narragansett, who live to the south? First, we'll speak with Darius Coombs and Loren Spears. Darius works at Plymouth Patuxent Museums, living history museums founded in the 1940s, that, through research, interprets the Wampanoag people and the colonial English community that settled amongst them in the 1600s. Loren is the executive director of the Tomaquag Museum, which was founded in 1958 by a Narragansett Pokanoket Wampanoag woman named Mary E. Glasgow. The Tomaquag Museum is Rhode Island's first and only Indigenous museum.
I'm still on my homeland today. I am Mashpee Wampanoag, and Mashpee is only maybe 20, 30 miles south of here. But the original homeland Wampanoag overall is large parts of Massachusetts, going in parts of Rhode Island. And for Wampanoag Nation, we probably numbered over 100,000 at one time. Today it's maybe about 15,000. And amongst that 100,000 at one time, there's probably over 70 Wampanoag communities. If you were like traveling back then, right, and you came this area around here, what is known as Plymouth today, and if I was from here and you came up to me and asked me what I was, I would say I'm a Patuxet. How about yourself? And I wouldn't say Wampanoag, because Wampanoag is a nation of people. And if you're traveling back then, I would expect you to know that already. This is Wampanoag country. So I would describe myself a Wampanoag speaking community I'm from. So all around this area, what is known as Plymouth today, is what we call Patuxet.
When we speak to Narragansett, we are speaking to a nation. I have heard that in the times of Verrazano, there may have been 100,000 people along Narragansett Bay. Now, when you think of Narragansett Bay, it's called Narragansett Bay for a reason, is that was part of our homeland. And I think that the Narragansett people were, before European contact, part of not only the mainland that we now think of as Rhode Island, but also the islands in the bay on both the East Bay and West Bay sides. And it wasn't until you got farther up into what's now called Bristol Warren today that it went more into Wampanoag territory. We had relationships with other nations that paid tribute to, is a way that historians often reference it, to the Narragansett for protection. So I mentioned to you that I was Narragansett Niantic. So I am part and a citizen of the federally recognized tribal nation, the Narragansett Nation. However, in our history, we had kinship relationships with other nations. And in those relationships, in some cases, smaller nations like the Niantic, the Nipmuc, and some of the Wampanoag nations paid tribute to the Narragansett. There were even tribal nations, to my understanding, on Montauk and Long Island and on Block Island and other islands that were part of what you might consider a confederacy of some sort or an alliance that was formed in order to protect people in the region. And so the Narragansett, before European contact, was a very large and what some people might use as a term, powerful nation.
A lot of things have been brought up with the Narragansett and Wampanoags. A lot of people say, oh, we were enemies, but it can't be just that black and white. They didn't like each other, or they did like each other. There's a lot of things going on back then. And it could have been small family things going on, but it shows in the records and the writings later on that people did get along. The Narragansett and the Wampanoag did have ties, which were positive. So it wasn't just all bad, between the two people.
The Narragansett and the Wampanoag are both Algonquian peoples. We have a similar language. We were interacting with each other, having kinship relationships. We live in a similar ecosystem, eastern woodland, coastal ecosystems. We have similar life ways. We are unique and individual people. However, we have similarities between us.
The Wampanoag leader, Osamoquin, or the Massasoit, decided to enter into a diplomatic treaty with the English settlers at Plymouth in 1621. The Narragansett did not. So these seem like different choices about how to engage with the settlers. Now, before the English settlers established their colony, it seems that relation between the Wampanoag and Narragansett could have been positive and fluid. with some Narragansett people intermarrying with some Wampanoag people, and with some Wampanoag paying tribute to the Narragansett Nation in exchange for protection from other Native American peoples or from the occasional European fisherman, trader, or enslaver. We also know that the Wampanoag and Narragansett peoples shared many similar ideas and traditions, such as their 13-moon calendar and their lives on the land and on the water.
As Indigenous people, we are the land. Our lifeways are from this land. We have our ceremonies based on this land. The 13 Thanksgivings that we celebrate in a year are connected to the gifts of the land that the Creator has blessed us with. And our stories are in this land. Our history is in this land. Our language is in this land. Our ceremonies, the clothes that we traditionally wear, our homes that we traditionally build, the means of travel that we created, all come from this land. And so when we think about this place, it's our homeland, but literally our ancestors are in this land. Our traditional creation story is that we're actually created from the clay, that the Creator formed us right out of the soil and that is attached to the water, out of the riverbeds, and created us here. And so our people have been here since time immemorial, and archaeologists and anthropologists, every so often they find what they call a discovery about our history, and they just keep going back in time. I believe right now they're at about 10,000 years that we've been in this place.
Land and water are important to the Narragansett and Wampanoag peoples. As Loren Spears noted, a Narragansett creation story tells how the Creator formed the Narragansett from the clay, created by the land's soil and water. This deep connection in the land highlights one reason why both the Narragansett and the Wampanoag peoples observe a 13-month year.
And seasons are very important, Everybody celebrates New Year's all around the world, but there's always different times when you celebrate New Year's depending on the culture of people. My culture of people, we celebrate it when everything comes to life. And that's during springtime, and that just makes sense. By that time of year, that's when the fish start running upstream. That's when the shadbush comes out, blooms. That's when the squirrel is as big as an oak leaf. And that's different signs of when your new year happens, and also different signs when you start planting.
The Wampanoag and Narragansett, who lived during the 16th and 17th centuries, organized their society around seasonal, sustainable food supply. In spring and summer, you'd find both peoples living in villages near the coastal waters where they fished and the soils where they planted. In the winter and fall, you'd find them inland, removed to large winter encampments where they had stored the food they had grown and harvested or hunted and fished in earlier months, and where the trees and distance from the water protected them from icy sea winds.
So I'm going to do a summer village for now. So in my mind, I envision our ancestors. There are people in the village, mothers and fathers moving about with grandparents. They're helping with children. They're tending older people and women, tending gardens and going out and gathering wild edibles, and men and sometimes women. I like to remind people women hunted too. It's Eurocentric, kind of a colonized mind to erase women from fishing and hunting and things of that nature. But they were doing that as well. And there were people making tools. So people weaving nets and weaving baskets and making pottery. You're by the water and you're harvesting this clay and you're tempering the clay with shell bits, and you're forming this clay and you're using shells and stone tools to smooth the clay, and you're putting it either adjacent to the fire or you're digging down into the coals to fire that pot and to create the cooking pots and the storage pots. You're collecting and harvesting materials for basketry, depending on the season and the time, grapevine, ash, other woods, oak, cedar, and you're making birch bark containers and cedar containers, and you're making cordage from bulrush, cattail, dogbane, milkweed, and you're harvesting and collecting these fibers and materials for that. You're cooking food, families have to eat.
That was the cycle, during the fall and winter, that's when you live in your big communities. Our fall and winter communities, being number over 70, as I was saying, would range in sizes anywhere from a few hundred to probably 2,000 or 3,000 people. You're looking at more or less like small towns. And each community would govern themselves, would have their sachem, which would mean chief. He or she would have their own councilmen, and they made the best decisions fit their community. So, and what we did during the winter, you see a lot of the men hunting. The 4 big animals we would hunt for, we would go for deer, black bear, moose, elk, a lot of small game like rabbits, squirrels, beavers, otters, raccoons. We also go for a lot of birds, a lot of ducks, partridge, quail, turkeys. The women probably spend a lot of time inside the houses, making baskets, mats, doing a lot of the cooking.
These are families. People often fictionalize Indigenous people and kind of erase the humanity of that. These are families that are working together, doing the jobs of the day.
All seasons were seasons for making and gathering the necessaries of life: food, storage containers, fishing nets, tools, and reed mats. Which, among other functions, reed mats were used in Wampanoag and Narragansett wigwams or weetus, traditional dome hut homes used in the 16th and 17th centuries. Now, how do we know about these tools and other necessaries of life? How do we know about the making of these tools? Well, in addition to having information from a rich oral tradition, passed from Wampanoag elders to Wampanoag youth, and a written historical record, we also have archaeological evidence from this period. In fact, archaeology can tell us a lot about the tools and other items in the world of the Wampanoag in the 16th and 17th centuries.
Archaeology really is the study of the human past through the objects that people left behind. And objects aren't, just the things that people made and dropped, but can also be evidence of structures that they had and ways that they were living. So archaeologists also get really excited about dirt stains. I'm Dr. Jade Lewis. I'm curator of collections here at Plymouth Patuxent Museums.
Jade is also a historical archaeologist.
So a lot of people, when they think about archaeology, they think about the digging. Archaeologists go out and they do really scientific excavation of different sites. When archaeologists are going out into the field, they're not specifically just looking for cool, shiny artifacts, but they're looking at how those artifacts relate to each other, relate to the landscape, relate to those stains in the dirt, and try and put together a picture of how people are living in the past in sort of a snapshot in time.
When I spoke with Jade, she was able to tell me about the archaeological digs that have taken place very near to where the Pilgrims landed, at the Wampanoag site of Patuxent, and at a new site in downtown Plymouth, which is being excavated by archaeologists from UMass Boston's Fisk Memorial Center for Archaeological Research. I asked Jade about the different snapshots that archaeological evidence could provide us about Wampanoag daily life during the 16th and 17th centuries.
Wampanoag people did have a really significant weaving culture that they did various designs. They would make fiber out of various types of plants and had a large number of natural dyes. Once you have the arrival of Europeans and things like wool cloth can get accessed, you actually have Wampanoag people taking that wool cloth to pieces and reweaving it in ways that are meaningful to the Wampanoag. Unfortunately, in archaeology, you don't get a whole lot of fabric preservation. It's a very particular type of circumstances that allow you to get exciting preservation like fabrics. Reed mats were something that would have been woven and, either used to cover summer weetus, provide a little bit more breeze, and also used indoors in the winter. So we know through the oral history and also just through how people were settling that they were accessing these reeds in the summer and the spring. And then probably the women were weaving these over that period. And archaeologically, the evidence for this weaving is we find bone mat needles all of the time. And a lot of earlier archaeology was saying that they were awls for punching leather, but they're just too thin and too fragile to work their way through leather. So a lot of those things that had been formerly thought to be awls, we're now looking at and going, oh, these are big mat needles to help in the weaving of these mats.
Archaeological evidence can tell us a lot about the material world of the Wampanoag. We know from oral histories that women made mats from cattail reeds, which they prepared for weaving. These mats were important and useful in Wampanoag life, and the archaeological evidence helps us see just how they wove those mats. The archaeological record can also help us see another aspect of this. The fact that Wampanoag and Narragansett women sometimes planted their corn, beans, and squash using fish caught from the ocean, rivers, and streams around them.
We grew our massive gardens, really, large agricultural gardens in our summer villages. The corn, the bean, and the squash were actually grown together. It's often referred to as the three sisters. The corn grows up as the eldest sister and is the tallest, and the bean wraps around the corn stalk and grows up, and it gives nitrogen back to the soil. And so that gives a nutrient back to the soil that our ancestors understood that science. And the squash grew, and its big leaves gave shade to the soil, which allowed the moisture to stay in and allowed them to have this relationship that went back and forth. And so in preparation, we would put fish in the soil, and that fish would break down and give extreme nutrients to the soil. So when we talk about symbiotic relationships between the land and the water, that's a perfect example of that.
Herring. Herring start running upstream during the spring, during New Year. That's a sign of New Year. When you see that fish, some people call it alewives, come up from the ocean. And what they do is the fish come up rivers from the ocean, and they go lay their eggs, and they go back downstream afterwards. So we eat the herring quite a bit. It's still amongst our culture, that's a common food for us. So we eat the herring, but a lot of time we also use it for fertilizer. We dig a hole in the ground, we put fish down in the hole, and we mound it over, and that's when we plant our corn and beans. And when the fish decomposes into Mother Earth, into the ground, it's going to add nutrients back into the ground. I don't think it was done every year because that's a lot of fish. Back then, a planting field for one family may take up an acre or two of land. So you didn't need to do it every year either. You know, you always plant right next to a river. And when you plant it next to a river, the land's fertile as it is.
We have that piece of dirt on display, and if you don't know what you're looking at, it looks very strange, but you can actually see the fish bones, which are probably herring bones, in the base of this planting mound and see how that looked in the field before it was taken out. The history of this is that this idea of Squanto teaching the English how to plant with fish was pretty unchallenged until about the 1970s and 1980s, where historians started to wonder if this is in fact a European practice that is being brought over by maybe not the Mayflower passengers, but other Europeans before the Mayflower passengers and taught to Indigenous people in the Northeast. A really important scholar here at the museum, Nana Pashmet, he saw these new ideas coming out. He decided to go into the historical documents and pull out every single instance of a European saying that this is this weird way that Indigenous people are planting corn, or this is the only way that we can plant with corn when it was showed to us by Indigenous people. Now, at the same time he was doing that research, an archaeologist was researching a planting field in Truro, Massachusetts, noting that you have these fish bones that are showing up in these planting fields, and worked with Nana Pashmet to kind of join forces as far as research.
Oral histories, written histories, and archaeological evidence tell us that the Narragansett and Wampanoag peoples used fish and a well-thought-out system for planting their crops that helped to ensure their planting soils would yield bountiful harvests of corn, beans, and squash, crops that could be consumed fresh or dried and stored for later use. As Lorenz Spears remarked, and as Darius Coombs described, water is just as important as land.
We have our natural springs going all up and down the rivers. You always plant during the spring and summer right next to a river. And by planting next to a river, the land's pretty fertile as it is. Fishing is very, very big amongst our culture, amongst our nation. We have a lot of fish in our diet during the spring and summer. The freshwater fish, bass, pickerel, trout, salmon, perch. You also have eels, snapping turtles. You got out in the saltwater, you got the striped bass, you got the bluefish, you got flounder. There's so much flounder out in the ocean they can walk out there back then and spare them, you know.
We traded on the water. You know, you went from one place to the other on the water. You visited family and friends on the water. You went by the open ocean and the bay and fed your community on the bounty of that water, those gifts of the sea. One of my most profound thoughts is around how did our ancestors harvest the whale? that was part of our annual lifeway to have the harvest of the whale. And that whale could feed large quantities of people, many, many villages at one time. And, the idea of our ancestors out there in dugout machines or canoes working in collaboration to hunt this mammoth animal and, having a dozen canoes out there and strategically positioning yourself and, having ceremony before to ensure your protection to get there and hunt the whale safely and then be able to come back and then have the Thanksgiving ceremony and harvest where we all come together in multiple villages that we're providing this food and this resource for many, many people is just amazing. Things have changed. We hunted seals and whales, and those are animals that we're not really hunting today because they're just not in the abundance that they once were in this region. When colonization and conquest happened, they changed the land.
Water provided the Narragansett and Wampanoag with fertile soils for their crops, fish to eat and to fertilize with, and with water mammals like seals and whales that would feed multiple villages. Now, I'd like for us to go back to Loren Spears, picturing her ancestors out on the open ocean, hunting for whales in machoons or canoes. What did these watercraft look like that they could handle the open sea and carry enough men to hunt down a whale?
Canoes, kayaks all mean the same thing. They're boats, For our language, it's machoon around here. I personally have made probably 50 or 60 boats myself, machoonashes. And our boats would range in sizes anywhere from a 9-foot one-man boat to we have boats big enough to carry over 40 men. We had 40-man boats being one tree. And those were either made out of white pine, chestnut, and even white oak. I always tell folks you have to put yourself back in time and what you have from natural resources around here, for which you had white pines around here growing over 150 foot in height, over 6 foot wide. It would not have been unusual seeing a 30 or 40-man boat being sailed out to Nantucket Island. And Nantucket is about 25, 30 miles off of Cape Cod. There's different ways of moving these boats. You can paddle them, you can pole them along the shore, or you would sail them. We have 3 different recordings of folks seeing those boats being sailed. And they're used for fishing, traveling, trading.
Just imagine how large these boats were. They were longer than 3 school buses, placed end to end. Now, the Wampanoag had a process for turning large trees, like those that Darius Coombs just described, into the watercraft they needed to fish, travel, trade, and hunt for whales.
Like I said, they're made from a log, made from a tree. People automatically think you chop these boats out. They're not chopped out. They're made by fire. You light the log on fire, let it burn down, then you scrape out the inside. So you burn, scrape until you're done. This is the type of fire you have. You don't burn soft wood inside. The types of wood you want to burn is a lot of oaks and maple. And when you burn oaks and maple inside of a log, that will burn down the hot coals so you can direct the heat right where you want it to be. If you burn pine inside of a pine tree, it's a soft wood and it flares up really quick and you can't control flame. So you don't want to use pine, you don't want to use a basswood because those are soft woods. You want to start a hardwood, produce a lot of heat and a low flame. Fire is not just used for the making of the boat, the hauling on the boat. It has a lot of benefits. Just the other day, we roasted 2 ducks over the boat while it was being made. So it keeps you warm, you can roast food over it, you have light, but the main purpose is to make it burning and scraping.
With machoons for sea and river travel, the Wampanoag used the waters around them as highways. As Loren Spears noted earlier, the Wampanoag and Narragansett used their boats to visit friends and family who lived in different parts of the North American Northeast. They also used their boats to conduct trade.
Before the arrival of Europeans, there's a lot of evidence for massive trade networks throughout the Northeast.
That's historical archaeologist and Plymouth Patuxet Museum's curator, Jade Lewis, talking about the Patuxet Wampanoag, who lived right in the same area where the settlers founded Plymouth. She's talking about how before the English arrived, there was a steady flow of native peoples and goods through Patuxet.
Smack in the middle of Patuxet, materials are coming from as far away as the Great Lakes region, New York, Pennsylvania, Maine. And oral history suggests that those trade networks extended further. And so you have a lot of the waterways being used to transport goods. You also have a lot of people going in and out of different communities and moving around a lot as political alliances are built, trade networks are expanded. And so there's, I think, this cultural idea of Indigenous people being isolated in their own little groups and enclaves, but in fact, there was constant movement of people around and interaction with different groups over time.
The Wampanoag had expansive trade networks. They traded with their neighbors, some as close as the women sachems among the Massachusetts. And they traded as far west as the Great Lakes, north into Canada, and south into the Carolinas, and perhaps even into Florida. How did these trade networks work? And what kinds of goods did these Eastern Woodlands peoples trade for?
It's not just a Wampanoag person's going all the way to the Great Lakes. It's more of different communities that are connected to each other. It seems that probably you'd have local communities in the Great Lakes region who would, trade goods into nearby communities, and those nearby communities would then move things down the line. So you might never go all the way to the Great Lakes region as a Wampanoag person, but you would at least have connections through that long range.
Trade is nothing new amongst our people, We had trade relations going toward the Great Lakes. We had trade relations going to Canada with Indigenous peoples. Far south was the Carolinas. It wasn't us necessarily having to go down there physically to do the trading, right? But you had a lot of the time, you had the stuff that bounced its way up here or across here through different networks. Like the only type of metal you would have seen around here pre-European would have been copper. Copper is not found around here, but it's found out in the Great Lakes. So we could have went out there, but it wasn't necessary for us to go out there. It made its way out here. So you had that network of trading all the time. There's all different signs of people coming on the coast from what was known as Canada, like a lot of the Mi'kmaq people were taking their birchbark boats down here along the coastline and doing a lot of intermarrying, a lot of diplomacy like that. So trade networks, yeah, we had them. It wasn't necessarily you had people that had something better than you. I mean, it might have been different, but just keep relations good, do friendly trading back and forth.
As Loren Spears tells us, people were coming to and from what we would consider to be a long way away.
There's old dances that we have, like the alligator dance that our community has been dancing for many, many years. Well, guess what? There's no alligators in Rhode Island. However, that tells you about how we went down the waterways, down the Atlantic and down those different river systems and met up with, and maybe we didn't go all the way to Florida, but maybe we were meeting with people in those different spaces. And that's how you were sharing different songs and different dances and different ceremonies, just as we do today. When we visit other tribal nations, you bring gifts. I'm wearing wampum today, and we would bring gifts of that wampum to other regions.
The Narragansett and Wampanoag engaged in trade, primarily to forge good kinship and diplomatic relations. As Loren Spears just discussed, sometimes trade functioned as a cultural exchange, whereby goods, songs, dances, and cultural knowledge were exchanged between different groups of people. As Darius Coombs put it, trade for the Wampanoag wasn't just about exchanging something you have for something different that you need or want. Trading was also about creating and maintaining friendly relationships with other peoples. Whether they traded physical goods, songs, dances, or other forms of cultural knowledge and traditions, the people of the Dawnlands traded to build and maintain positive understandings and positive relationships with neighboring and distant peoples. So, how did this long cultural tradition of trade inform how they approached trading with Europeans? For one thing, trading with Europeans wasn't anything new. The Wampanoag, for instance, had been interacting with Europeans for almost 100 years before the arrival of the Mayflower.
So you have Europeans coming to the Northeast primarily to access the cod fisheries. Cod was huge business in the 16th and 17th century, and you had traders who would encounter Indigenous people on these shores and trade and interact with them. So when the people in the Mayflower arrived, the Wampanoag are familiar with them. They've maybe encountered Europeans themselves. They had at least encountered probably other Indigenous people who had traded or communicated with Europeans. And there's, in many ways, a complicated history that's already been established for 100 years before Mayflower arrives.
There were people coming over. The first time there was written recording was Verrazano. He went down and did some trading with the Narragansetts in Rhode Island.
In addition to what we know from oral histories, We also know from written European sources that, like many native peoples along the North American Atlantic coast, the Wampanoag had been interacting with Europeans from Spain, France, the Netherlands, and England since the 1520s, just as they did when Giovanni Verrazzano explored the Atlantic coast for France in 1524. What did Verrazzano and the men who followed him look for? What did they hope to gain from their trade with northeastern Native Americans like the Wampanoag? Stay tuned as we'll answer these questions and explore the Wampanoag's early trade and encounter with Europeans right after we hear from our episode sponsors. As you're listening to this series, The World of the Wampanoag, you may want to check out a new book coming next spring from our friends at the Library of America, Plymouth Colony, Narratives of English Settlement and Native Resistance from the Mayflower to King Philip's War. This volume is edited by scholars Lisa Brooks and Kelly Wisecup. Published for Plymouth's 400th anniversary, Plymouth Colony includes a vast array of writings from multiple points of view, including Indigenous voices and perspectives, so it can give its readers a multifaceted view of Plymouth Colony, which was formed within Wampanoag homelands. Plymouth Colony includes a full text of William Bradford's Of Plymouth Plantation, his journal and reflections of the settlement, which he kept over decades. The volume also includes a wide range of documents that provide insight into the experiences of the Wampanoag people and their leaders. The nonprofit Library of America champions our nation's cultural heritage by publishing America's greatest writing and authoritative new editions, and providing resources for readers to explore this rich, living legacy. To explore and pre-order Library of America's Plymouth Colony, Narratives of English Settlement and Native Resistance from the Mayflower to King Philip's War, visit benfranklinsworld.com/Plymouth. That's benfranklinsworld.com/Plymouth. You may also be interested in a new archaeology exhibit at the Plymouth Patuxent Museums, which commemorates the 400th anniversary of the Mayflower. The exhibit is called History in a New Light, Illuminating Archaeology of Historic Patuxent and Plymouth. Founded in 1947 as a museum, Plymouth Patuxent offers powerful personal encounters with history, built on thorough research about the Wampanoag people and the English community who settled amongst them in the 1600s. Plymouth Patuxent also maintains one of the most significant repositories of New England 17th century archaeology. The exhibit History in a New Light, Illuminating Archaeology of Historic Patuxent and Plymouth, uses archaeology, documentary research, oral history, and fine and decorative arts. It's the first major exhibit to display artifacts from both the Wampanoag village of Patuxent and the site of the original 1620 European settlement, which were discovered beginning in 2016 by Project 400 archaeologists, which is an ongoing archaeological research initiative conducted in partnership with the Andrew Fisk Center for Archaeological Research at the University of Massachusetts Boston, the Town of Plymouth, and the Plymouth Patuxent Museums. Now, in addition to finding the first evidence of these overlapping settlements, this research has forced scholars to reevaluate their understandings of daily life in early Plymouth and the nature of colonial and Indigenous interactions. To learn more about the exhibit History in a New Light, or to plan your next visit to the Plymouth Patuxent Museums, visit benfranklinsworld.com/archaeology. That's benfranklinsworld.com/archaeology. So, what did Verrazzano and the men who followed him look for? What did they hope to gain from their trade with northeastern Native Americans, like the Wampanoag?
They came over for beaver skins, right? They wanted the beaver and otter. A lot of beaver and otter were decimated over Europe. And we have plenty around here. This is important that you hear the terms fishermen and traders. In that one breath, you got to say fishermen, traders, and enslavers, because that's fact. These people weren't just coming over for fishing and trading. They were also taking native people back over to Europe.
European explorers and fishermen traded for furs and peltry they no longer had in Europe, and for foodstuffs that they needed to support their seasonal fishing villages or for their return voyages across the Atlantic. Now, sometimes these explorers and fishermen kidnapped, and in some instances also enslaved, native peoples, including a well-known member of the Wampanoag Nation.
Best known to most people as Squanto, Tisquanton was a Wampanoag man who was taken captive by English sailors in 1614, returned to his home in what is now the town of Plymouth, which he knew as Patuxent, in the year 1619.
Andrew Littman is an associate professor of history at Barnard College and the author of the forthcoming book, The Death and Life of Squanto.
he was a witness, at least at a distance, to the visits of Bartholomew Gosnold to Cape Cod Bay in 1602, probably to the visit of Martin Pring in 1605, and Samuel de Champlain in 1605 as well. If we sort of guess what his age was, probably was not a particularly active participant in those encounters, but almost certainly would have seen ships at a distance, would have heard accounts of people who participated in those visits, even picked up and been able to see some of the trade goods that were exchanged in those visits.
European explorers like Bartholomew Gosnold interacted and traded with Wampanoag men to gather intelligence about the land, its people, and its resources. Often, communication in these exchanges could be very difficult, as few Europeans spoke Wampanoag and few Wampanoags spoke European languages. Sometimes, European traders and explorers took native men like Tisquanto captive, with the goal of creating translators. But as Andrew Littman tells us, they were also enslaving these native men too.
From these early accounts, we know that there's several different modes of communication. There's just general sort of hand sign pointing, the way that anyone in a country where they don't know a single word sort of gets by. There are enough repeat visitors from 1605 onwards, other native men from the Dawnland regions, from both near where Patuxet and further away, who've been taken as captives, who then start to act as translators and go-betweens. This is where Tisquanto's story is a bit different from the majority of native men taken captive. Most of the native men taken captive by English people, and as well by French as well, were brought immediately back to either England or France. Tisquanto is a little different in that his captor, Thomas Hunt, took those 24 men. He was planning to sell them, not to use them as translators or guides, but to sell them as slaves into a Spanish market for enslaved indigenous people.
Prior to 1620, the Wampanoags' trade with European visitors often took the form of a one-way trade or exchange, where Europeans took Wampanoag men captive and unwittingly exchanged microbes that unleashed deadly periods of pandemic that wiped out entire villages of Wampanoag people like those who lived at Patuxet.
We still suffer from a major epidemic that wiped out probably up to 90% of our people in a 2 or 3 year span. Our skin turned yellow, people got open sores in their bodies, and they died within 2 or 3 days. Common thought over the years, hepatitis. People say smallpox, but we kind of ruled out smallpox. Disease control came out with something over 10 years ago. They believe it was from the French trade ships up in Maine. And when those trade ships came over, they would have rats on the ships. And the rats would get off, and the fetus of the rats would get into the water system, creating infectious liver disease that swept along the coastline. It was between probably 1616 and 1619. It went 30, 40 miles inland along the coast of Maine, wiped out whole nations of people. And like I said, for Wampanoag people, it affected us up to 90%. It stopped right before the Narragansett started. This epidemic that came here was 3 years before the Pilgrims got here, right?
European diseases ravaged the North American Northeast and devastated the Wampanoag. As Darius Coombs noted, it's likely that 90% of the Wampanoag were infected by the Great Epidemic of 1616 to 1619. The epidemic created profound loss and wrought great devastation among the Wampanoag. It also created a unique and very recent set of conditions for the English colonists who sailed aboard the Mayflower. Many European settlers seem to think that North America was not a settled place. In fact, they often wrote about it that way, sometimes just to justify their taking of land. But when the Pilgrims landed, they encountered a place that, while the homeland of the Wampanoag for thousands of years, was very recently, because of the epidemic, a much less populated place.
When they got here, it was a changed place. When they got here, it was a year, 2 years after that epidemic hit us, you know? If they landed 4 or 5 years before, it might have been a different story. This whole area was populated with people. And when they landed in Patuxet, this whole area was devastated. The nearest living communities was probably Manomet, was called Manomet, about 10 miles south. We're a caring people, we're a loving people. But it's also a good time which people needed each other, you know? They needed an ally because of the Native communities that didn't care for them being here. And also we needed an ally a lot of the time because we just got devastated. We needed help in a way. They needed each other. It was a very, very confusing time too. The leaders we lost, the chiefs, the medicine people, the political leaders.
On December 16, 1620, the ship Mayflower sailed into Plymouth Harbor. The English colonists aboard her found a cleared area that had recently been the home of a Wampanoag spring and summer village called Patuxet. Unbeknownst to the colonists, the epidemic that raged up until a year before their arrival had wiped out most of the Wampanoag's Patuxet population.
They landed here. They landed in Wampanoag country. That's when they landed in Patuxet. And when they landed here, they found devastation. And that's when they started building in December 1620.
Things started to change in the 1600s as the Pilgrims, as we know, and we're talking about 400 years since they landed here with the Mayflower. And that was the beginning of the change when people started to, quote unquote, settle here, meaning that they didn't leave. That started this huge change in the land.
The world of the Wampanoag. After thousands of years in the Dawnlands, the Wampanoag had a deeply established economy, culture, and politics. They had also experienced more than 100 years of encounters with Europeans. But their world had changed in the wake of the destabilizing epidemic, in just a few years before the Pilgrims arrived in 1620. So the specific circumstances when the Mayflower sailed into what the English would call Plymouth Harbor were very new. Join us next week for our next episode, when we explore the world of the Wampanoag in 1620 and beyond, a world that now included the Pilgrims and their settlement at Plymouth. This episode is part of a 2-episode series about the world of the Wampanoag, which is co-written and co-produced by Liz Covart and Karen Wolf, and made possible with support from Mass Humanities. If you're looking for more information about our series, our guest experts and scholars, or notes and links for everything we discussed today, visit the show notes page, benfranklinsworld.com/290. The show notes page is also where you'll find a list of resources and texts that we used to write this series. Plus, you'll also find some pictures of the objects we discussed today, like machoons and fish bones as fertilizer. Again, you can access this list of resources and the pictures at benfranklinsworld.com/290. We're grateful to the large number of historians, tribal experts and spokespeople, and museum professionals who took the time to speak with us during the course of our research. We're also grateful for the research assistance provided by Gail Coughlin and Eugene Tesdall. The original music you heard throughout this episode was composed by Joel Roston, in collaboration with Wampanoag musician Durwood Vanderhoop, with additional music by Narragansett musicians Sharente Harris, Lindsay Montanari, and Akeki Harris. The Wampanoag and Narragansett songs included in the score and arranged throughout this episode were composed by Durwood Vanderhoop, Sharente Harris, and Akeki Harris. Production assistance for this podcast comes from the Omohundro Institute's digital audio team: Joseph Edelman, Martha Howard, Holly White, and Karen Wolf. Be sure to tune in 2 weeks as the Ben Franklin's World Revisited series examines the second and final episode in this 2-part miniseries. Finally, any views, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this episode do not necessarily represent those of the National Endowment for the Humanities. This podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. To discover and listen to their other podcasts, visit airwavemedia.com. Ben Franklin's World is a production of Colonial Williamsburg Innovation Studios.